Welcome back to the podcast. You'll notice there are fewer episodes these days. That's because I've been working on my book. Character Driven Leadership for Women is now out, and you can get it wherever you purchase your books. And because of that, I've also had less energy, time, and resources to record podcasts. But I have been guests on some podcasts as I work to promote the book and support the challenges that are going on in the nonprofit sector. Which brings me to today's episode. I'm sharing an interview that I did on the CharityVillage Connects podcast with Mary Barroll, and we talked about succession planning. It was part of a number of different interviews they did and some research they did. I will make sure that I link the full episode that Charity Village did to talk about the succession crisis in the nonprofit sector. Here's the bottom line. We don't talk about the succession planning crisis in our organizations as much as we need to. We don't talk about what is succession planning. What does it actually look like? How do we create the next generation of leaders? You're going to hear some of that as we dive into the discussion that Mary and I had around the succession planning crisis in the nonprofit sector. Let's go there now.
Welcome to Charity Village Connects. I'm Mary Barroll. The nonprofit sector is set in the coming decade to see a massive turnover in leadership as the boomers retire. Indeed, sector experts say this trend started during the pandemic as many established leaders stepped back from their roles and opted for early retirement. How can the sector be more intentional about succession planning in order to build sustainable organizations? What does it take to build a succession planning strategy, attract more young people to the sector, and build better pipelines for recruiting boards of directors? Joining us to discuss these important issues is leadership development coach Kathy Archer. As a certified leadership coach, Kathy helps women develop confidence, maintain their composure, and lead with integrity. She's the author of Mastering Confidence and the host of the Surviving to Thriving podcast. Kathy brings over 13 years of experience in coaching leaders and has worked in the social profit sector for 25 years, leading programs and actively involved in community development. Welcome to the podcast, Kathy.
Thank you, Mary. I'm excited to be here.
Well, as you know, we're seeing a massive demographic shift in the sector with a vast number of leaders currently retiring or getting ready to retire in the somewhat near future. How are you seeing this impact the organizations and leaders you are working with?
It's definitely impacting, and it's impacting hard, I think. There are a number of senior leaders who are thinking about leaving, as you've said, and some of them are afraid to talk about it. And that's part of the problem. They aren't sure that it's okay to address it. They aren't sure how to address it. So part of it is we're not creating succession plans. We're not having that conversation. I think the other thing is the people that are sort of next in line aren't really ready to take over. And so you're left with a leader who's got sort of one foot sort of out the door, but isn't sure who to hand it off to. And there isn't the plan or the strategy or the training ready, set, kind of been in place to do that.
So I'm hearing that the organizations, well, some of whom or many of whom that you're working with, just aren't doing enough to prepare for leadership pathways for individuals who have leadership potential or who are interested in moving into those roles. What could they be doing better?
I think training and supporting for one, but I think clearly communicating for two. I think, like I say, we're not having the conversations. I think we need to step back and really clearly identify this is when I'm thinking about leaving, or not even a date, but in the next year or 5 years, and let's start talking about how we're going to transition. And maybe it is the current leaders that have the ability to move up. But if not, then what do we need to do to start bringing new people into the organization? Or how do we start preparing these people who are right now saying, I don't want to do it, or we're saying you're not ready? What's going to get them from here to here? And let's start making that game plan and starting to be more overt about it, not just within our organizations, but I think in the sector in general. I get all these emails about nonprofits and, everybody's got training going on, and rarely do you see anything around succession planning. You don't sort of see, here's sort of the steps to create a succession plan and let's help you with it. And it's not sort of talked about. We're talking about the crisis that we have, but we're not talking about the strategies of how to deal with that crisis.
Do you think that there are barriers preventing young and diverse leaders from stepping into nonprofit leadership positions? Are they just not being invited, or are there real barriers within the sector that we're not talking about?
Well, let's start with the barriers within them first. I think they look at the leaders and go, no way. Like, I do not want to do what those guys are doing. And so I think that's part of it. That's the barrier that the sector has created is we've got leaders who are overwhelmed, overloaded, burning out, scrambling, struggling to keep up. And the next in line leader looks at them and says, I don't want that lifestyle. I don't want to be that kind of person. And so as a sector, we've created this culture where we are, I always talk about it sort of as the whack-a-moles, or, if we're old enough to remember the I Love Lucy game where, or the show where she was like taking the chocolates out, like we're just whacking the moles and trying to keep up and we're struggling. And, you said at the beginning, my podcast is Surviving to Thriving. We're in survival mode. And so as a younger leader or a next in line leader, I look at that and say, no, thank you. Like, I don't want that. So I think that's part of it. I think then the next step is we're not teaching them how to be leaders. We're teaching them the nuts and bolts of the organization. So, if I work with some disability organizations. Well, here's the forms that we fill out, and here's when you have to write them up, and here's, when we have to apply for the next grant. But we're not teaching them, okay, how do you have that conversation with somebody who's not showing up on time? Certainly you can discipline them, but that's a form. That's not a leadership conversation. And so we're not teaching them, we call it soft skills, but essentially that's what we're lacking is that ability to have those difficult conversations, maintain our composure, inspire and motivate people and get them to go, here's where I am. I mean, we have people come in and we hire them, we love their resume and we think they're amazing. And then they flatline and we're like, well, what's going on? Well, we haven't taken them to that next level. And that's your job as a leader, is to go, here's where they are, but here's what I see in them. How can I grow that? How can I develop that? And we are just whacking moles. We are filling out forms. We are, doing month end. We are applying for the next grant, but we're not developing people and we're not taught how to do that.
It's interesting when you think of all the leaders that had to struggle to keep their organizations going through the pandemic, and that sort of immediate kind of urgency that was going on, and those that stuck with their roles rather than stepping back and retiring. I suspect that, even now it's been a real challenge with inflation and other sorts of economic pressures that are going on. I imagine that it's only now potentially where leaders can take a breath, look up, and look forward to the future as opposed to just, in that survival mode. Is that part of the problem?
Yes. And you raise another soft skill, hope. A leader needs to demonstrate hope. And those leaders that survived the pandemic and brought their team through it with a level of, not just like barely hanging on, had a sense of hope. And we don't teach leaders how to create a sense of hope. Is not Pollyanna optimism. Hope is like, tomorrow will be better than today. Here's how we're going to get there. And here's 6 different pathways that we might have to, if plan A doesn't work, we're going to go to plan B. But often leaders miss one of those 3 components. And so, when we look at where people are at now, yeah, they got their team through with a sense of hope and they, brought that all together. And yeah, now they're going, oh, we made it. But there's this huge residual effect of what happened over the last few years. And, some organizations at the same time here in Alberta, the family visitation sector went through a massive funding change a month before COVID hit. And there's like all of this impact of, loss of teams members and loss of funding that never got sort of worked through emotionally and as a team. So you've got that, and then you've got the whole pandemic. And yeah, now we're going, okay, now what? How do we get ourselves back together? And it's hard. It's really hard.
So, how do we actually stop the leakage of people who could potentially be leaders and are saying, no, thanks, this is not for me, it is not appealing to me? How do we stop that leakage and start building them and building their skill sets in order to, I guess, have the confidence and the desire to embrace these challenges and lead organizations?
Yeah. I think we start talking about leadership different than the role or the title that you're moving up into. I have one organization that I'm working with, and they're identifying leaders and they're bringing them in and doing training with them and supporting them. And they're not even in a leadership position, but they're talking about what leadership means and they're developing those skills. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to, you know, there's a difference between managing and leading, and we don't talk about that, right? We don't talk about, yes, you have to get the paperwork done and fill out the forms and make sure everybody gets paid. But yeah, you also have to grow people and develop them and see that vision and move people forward. And we're not talking about what leadership means. And so I think if potential leaders started to go, oh, leadership is inspiring and motivating people, I like that. I don't want to do all the paperwork, but help me learn how to do this, right? So I think that's part of it. But then I think we need to start teaching people the human skills of leadership. You know, um, I love that we talk about psychological safety or ethics or the whole diversity conversation, but we don't talk about how do I have that conversation when I'm struggling? You know, when something's going on, how do I deal with my emotions when that's happening? How do I deal with somebody else's emotions? I had somebody reach out to me the other day and she says, two staff are fighting and it's a power struggle. And I'm like, yep, that happens all the time, right? How do I deal with that? That's different than how do I fill out the form and how do I, you know, what meetings do I have to attend? And so that's the things we need to start teaching.
And I guess, I mean, what we're talking about is additional resources that many small organizations may have a great difficulty in accessing. What do you say to organizations who say, yeah, I know it's a weakness. I need to start doing this, but I don't know how I'm going to fit it into the budget. And I don't know where to go to get these potential resources. Could you give some advice on that point?
Yeah. So I often talk to individual leaders and I tell them, you need to take responsibility for your growth and development. Do not expect that your boss has time, energy, money to do that. Take responsibility for your own development, adopt a growth mindset, and create your own personal and professional learning curriculum. When I moved into leadership, I hit the library. I ordered a stack of books on networking. I didn't know what to do when I walked into a room, right? And so I started looking at how do I grow myself? And I started going, well, here's a hole over here. I'll take the community college course. Here's a hole over here. I'll take, you know, order this book from wherever, or I'll take this webinar. So we need to start that process individually. And I think that's what organizations need to do. It would be lovely if we had a ton of money. Probably not going to happen. So you need to look at, and there are so many free resources out there. Like I say, the library is your best resource. You know, get an Audible account, $15 a month, and you can listen to books. Start to tune in, and I will say to people, find your mentors out here. They don't have to be within the organization. You know, I loved reading books from people like Eleanor Roosevelt. What did you have to learn from her back in the day, right? So create your own curriculum. And I think organizations need to start doing that as well. Have a book club. There's nothing wrong with grabbing a book and saying, I do my Mastering Confidence book club for organizations 6 weeks, right? And like, that's not hard to do. Grab a book and sit down and look at it. I think we also need to advocate within the sector for more resources. But we know that that's the long game. And so we have to really start taking responsibility. And again, having those conversations with our leader. That's the other thing. I think organizations, when we talk about one-to-one meetings, it's the tasks. What are we doing? Who's your client list? What's the programs you're working on? Right, right. But we don't talk about, so what about your personal goals? What are you working on? We talk about it at, you know, performance appraisal time. If performance appraisals happen, so many times they're not even being done. But if you could make that a part of your regular one-to-one conversations, what are you working on? How are you developing that? What book are you reading? What's the training you're taking? What's the growth edge that you have? Where's what's lacking? How can I give you some supports in that area? And start to create that culture where individual personal and professional development becomes a part of the work we just do every day.
So actually, you've answered the question from an important and interesting two different perspectives. You spoke about what an individual might be able to do to actually, I guess, develop their leadership skills independent of any resources that might be offered by their employer. And then you also talked about a leader who might be able to sort of develop new or, I guess, innovative ways to help young potential leaders develop these skills by pointing them to resources that are easily accessible. And I think I appreciate your answer in that fulsome way. I'm curious, have you noticed that organizations are opening up opportunities for new leaders to potentially learn on the job the skills that they would need to actually reach a higher level in terms of a potential leadership role?
Yeah, I think they are. Unfortunately, I think it's often being done in a we're so desperate for somebody, move them into the next level. And so again, that's the problem. They're moving into the level. And we see this, and this has been across the sector since the dawn of time. We move people up from frontline into leadership without the training to go with it. They're good at this job they do, so we move them up. But this isn't the same job. And so, yes, we're moving people up into new leadership positions all the time, and then they don't do what we expect them to do, or they burn out, or they move on, and we wonder why. And it's because we haven't taught them that, that extra piece of what they can do to sort of help them be that kind of leader.
You mentioned the lack of succession planning in the sector, and I wonder if you could address that in a deeper dive and talk about what can leaders of organizations do to start creating a potential way towards developing a succession plan. What goes into a succession plan?
I think what goes into the succession plan is a lot of, again, those gaps. Here's the next in line leader, but what's the gaps? What do we need to fill to help you feel comfortable stepping into this next position and have the desire to step into that next position? When we were talking a minute ago, I was thinking, I believe it's OWN Ontario Network that did a deep dive into a few years back what sort of the competencies of a leader are. And something like that, you just take it and you go, how does this all fit in? Where do you feel comfortable? What do you feel good at? I am an avid Toastmaster and I have been since I left my leadership role. And I regret that so much. I think if I'd been able to become a Toastmaster early on in my leadership career, I would have developed that confidence to speak in public. I would have understood more about what was happening at business meetings and feel a little bit more politically savvy to go into those meetings. That's a simple thing that you can add into your day. But unless I sort of see the competency of, having that political savviness, which, I mean, what is that? I don't know as a brand new leader. I don't understand. But you walk into a boardroom with all of these people and you're like, what am I doing here? And you feel like your mouth is full of marbles, right? And so that's a skill to learn. And without that sort of identifying that gap, here's a hole. What can fill that gap? Well, have you been to a chamber meeting? Have you, where are you starting to step out of side of your comfort zone, meet with people that maybe don't talk the same sort of language you talk, and develop that level of confidence and political savviness? Does that answer the question a little bit?
Are there I think so, yeah. Are there common areas where you see either leaders or emerging leaders struggling and needing additional support or mentorship or education? Like what what are their biggest gaps and how do they access that type of support?
Biggest gap, I mean, maybe it's because I work in the level of confidence, but it's the confidence. It's the imposter syndrome. Again, they've moved up from frontline into this position without sort of the training. So, I look back when I moved into leadership and I'm like, I'm the youngest one here. I don't have the experience. I talk about my kids, like what's going on here, right? And so that imposter syndrome hits them. So one of the biggest gaps that I think and I'm guessing, Mary, you've done a lot of the inner work, like a lot of leaders who have gotten to the level you're at, is that managing our thoughts. When we're learning to go into conversations and we're like, I don't know how to do this, I'll often tell people, just say the word yet after. If you just add the word yet, you're adopting that growth mindset, you're developing a sense of confidence, and you're starting to manage what's going on. My son came, we were sitting outside in the backyard last night. And my son came just after shift work and he was vibrating. It's like just, and it made me think of a client I had the other day. Sometimes something happens and we just like, you can't let go of whatever it is. You're so frustrated or angry, or how do you manage that? It's your thoughts, right? You start from that learning to have that emotional intelligence, learning to maintain that composure, learning to, navigate what you're thinking so that you can have that difficult conversation, go into that board meeting, whatever it is. And I think that's part of, I forget the beginning part of your question. Now I get off on this sometimes, but that's part of what's lacking for leaders is knowing that again, it's the inner work that when you move up from frontline into leadership, we're not talking, I mean, there is a whole part about tactical skills that you need to learn, but really when you rise up, it's more personal development. And as you move up into leadership, it really is starting to get to know yourself, understand your values. What are my ethics, morals? What hills will I die on? How do I become the leader? You were reading in my introduction about leading with integrity. What does that even mean? And how do I become that leader? Well, I need to know the list that I desire to live to, but then I need to learn how to live that list. It's lovely to say I am a calm, engaging, motivating leader until I lose it. How do I align those?
What are the top complaints you hear from nonprofit leaders relating to their challenges in creating some sort of talent pipeline that could be the leaders of tomorrow? Are there things that the board could be doing to ease these issues for the executive director, for example? What could boards be doing to support um, their own leaders in being able to create a succession plan or developing talent within the existing workforce?
Boards can have the courage to have that conversation with the leader. I think often we get somebody into that position and they're seasoned and they're doing wonderful and we're like, let's just leave well enough alone, right? Let's not, poke the bear. Uh, but have that conversation. What's your long-term plan? And I know that sometimes we're afraid that I'm not allowed to ask those questions. I can't ask how old they are. Uh, but without that, you're not sort of creating the structure and again, the culture in your organization to address that, to have those conversations. So boards can start with that and then start to say, what supports do you need? Because it may not be the board that helps them have those conversations or make the succession plan, but what do you need to help get there? What can we start to put in place? Where do we need to sort of identify funding perhaps? Uh, are there ways, other creative ways that we can help build leaders from within? But start to have that conversation, I think, is the first step boards need to do.
Yeah, it can be a delicate dance, especially if you're a board of directors in an organization where you've had a leader in place for a very long time. And it's a delicate sort of thing to start opening up the discussion of who is your successor without, I guess, some risk of, offending or perhaps threatening that existing leader.
Well, exactly. And a lot of those executive directors are founders or close to being founders, which creates a whole nother level of difficulty in having that conversation. And again, circles us right back to soft skills for everybody. How do you have that? Like you say, it's a delicate conversation.
Well, I think that raises a very interesting second question, which is um, you do have these founders, leaders that had the vision to start the organization, decades earlier. And many of the board members would have been invited onto the board by some sort of network that the actual existing leader has. And I guess the board, I suppose, has to understand that from a governance perspective, it's their responsibility. It is their role to, hire the executives that will run the organizations. And so, what would you say to boards to, I guess, address a potential sort of paralysis around this that could be preventing them from creating succession planning?
Yeah, again, do your own work because these are hard conversations. They're not easy conversations. I think, you just said a governance board. I think a lot of boards say they're governance boards, but aren't. And that's the other thing. Get the board training you need. Know what your role is. Know there are oodles of resources out there for boards. And again, many of them free or low cost to understand your role as a board, to understand what you're supposed to be doing. I bet, I'm just going to throw this out there, If you searched on some place like Coursera or something like that, there's a free board course that you can get, and I bet there's something on succession planning in there. You just need to do the work. You need to reach out and go, okay, where do I look for a template, a plan, a system, a book? Look on Amazon. Bet there's succession planning books out there. But it's having the courage, again, back to soft skills, having the courage to say, we need to work on this. I'm going to do some research, learn how to do it, and then I'm going to have that tough conversation.
Well, interestingly enough, Charity Village has developed with subject matter experts courses on board governance as well as succession planning. So we also offer them as well. Um, what do you think nonprofit leadership will look like in the next 5 to 10 years when this real sort of transition out of boomer leaders happens? Do you think we're going to see an entirely different style of leadership develop?
I would love to say yes. I'm not so sure we're going to change in 5 years. I think it's a gradual change. And I think the leaders that will step in have been so cultured in the current way that it's going to take some time. I have 5 granddaughters, and I often say I don't do the work for the current leaders. I do, but it's the trickle down effect. We're going to start making ripples, especially if we intentionally do it. And so we have to start pushing back. We have to start creating those ripples. And I think you'll start to see those become waves in the next 5 to 10 years, but I don't think we're going to see a dramatic shift. I wish we were. But I also think that change takes time, and that's a good thing. We have to sort of work with it. It's sort of the 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of theory. Let's see where we go. Okay, let's stabilize. When I talk about the difference between management and leadership, I often talk about that. The management is keeping, the boat afloat, but leadership is taking us forward, and we need both, right? So the development of leadership is on a path, and I think it's moving in the right direction with a little bit of, rough edges along the way, but I think we're going there.
Well, Kathy, you look way too young to have 5 granddaughters, to be honest. Any final words of advice that you might leave both for leaders, boards of directors, or even the individual that might be willing to contemplate a role in leadership?
I'm working on my second book on character development and leadership. And the line that goes through every chapter is self-reflection is the key to character development. Self-reflection is the key to leadership. You need to spend time doing the inner work. Like you have to understand what values you have and what you stand for and what the life you're creating. It's that self-reflection that will take you from a frontline staff and sort of doing the job of management to actually leading yourself and then leading an organization. Yeah, do the inner work. It's required of leadership.
Well, Kathy, this is such an important challenge for nonprofit organizations to address and start looking now for the future, for their continued resilience in the sector. And thank you for your insights and advice. And thank you for joining us at Charity Village Connects.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mary.